All right, let's start by doing a little bit of a review. See if you can determine what these are without using your calculator or notes. The sine of 45, cosine of 135, so on and so forth. So put this on pause and see if you can figure it out. All right, well, if you remember the sine of 45, that's in quadrant 1, so you know that should be one of the ones that you memorized. So that's the square root of 2 over 2. The cosine of 135, well, you're going to have to figure out what the reference angle is. So your reference angle is going to be 45. So what you're really asking is what is the cosine of 45, which is the square root of 2 over 2. And then you have to know what quadrant you're in. You're going to be in the second quadrant, so the cosine would be negative. So this would be negative square root of 2 of 2. And I'll just go through the rest. If you have questions on any of these, please email me, and I'll be happy to explain them to you. All right, so today we're going to talk about how to graph a sine and cosine curve. So what I'd like you to do is in your calculators, clear out anything you have in your Y editor and turn your plots on. So remember, you just kind of go in your Y editor, go up to plot 1 and highlight it, and it'll be on. And then go into mode and change it from degrees to radians. All right, and then you're going to take out your unit circle and you're going to go all the way around your unit circle, and you're going to put all the radians in L1 and all the sine figures in L2. So for instance, if I start at 0, 0, well, 0 is 0 radians and the sine is 0. If I go to the next one, which is pi over 6, the sine is 1/2. If I go to the next one, pi over 4, the sine is square root of 2 over 2. And I'm going to keep going around the whole unit circle and putting that in. It'd be easier if you had the unit circle in front of you. When you put it into your calculator, however, realize that when you type in pi over 6, it's going to change it to a decimal. And when you type in the square root of 2 over 2, it's going to change that as a decimal. So it's going to look sort of like this when you start to put it in. All right, so I actually put in here, I put in pi over 6, but it changed it to 0.5236, and I put in 1/2, but it changed it to 0.5. So once you put that in, you have to set your window. And so if you kind of look at these, remember your curve going around is going to go from 0 to 2 pi. So it's going to go from 0 to a little bit more than 6. And L2, if you look at that, it's going to go from +1 to -1. So that's what your sine is going to go from. So if I set my window, I'm going to set it, I'd like to set it a little bit more than what it is. So I'm going to set it from -1 to 7 because I just kind of want that piece of it. And then my Y minimum, again, I'm going to go a little bit more than 1 and -1. So I'm going to go to 1.5. And when you graph it, you see the graph will look like this. So all we did was really take your unit circle and kind of put it on a horizontal graph. So you can see this is what your sine curve will look like. There's a couple of things that you should notice about your sine curve. First of all, if you take a look here, it's going to start at 0 and it's going to end at 0. And it's going to go through one full, what they call a cycle. So it's going to go up once and then down once. That's one full cycle. And halfway in between this cycle, it's at 0 again. Then you're going to notice halfway in between these 2 points, it's going to be at its highest point. And halfway between these 2 points, it's going to be at its lowest point. And we're going to use those features of the sine curve and the cosine curve in a minute in order to help us graph them. So this here is what the sine curve looks like. You can graph it in both radians or degrees. It doesn't really matter. Again, you can see it starts at 0, ends at 0, is 0 halfway in between, at its highest point, halfway in between the first 2 zeros, and the lowest point halfway between the next 2 zeros. This distance from 0 to where it ends, where it takes one full cycle, is called the period. Whoops. It's called 1 period. So the length here from 0 to 2 pi is 1 period. The height of each one of these little bumps, if you will, is called the amplitude. So when you have your equation of a sine curve, the generic form is y equals a times the sine of bx. Now that's if we don't have any horizontal shifting, which we'll talk about later. So the amplitude is defined as the absolute value of a in this case. So if this a here, this one here was 1, it would look like this. But if this a was 2, then this bump would kind of go up here to 2, and it would go down here to -2. So, whoops, kind of missed, but it would kind of stretch it out. So the amplitude is always given as a positive number. So even though this here is also the height of the curve, it's always given as a positive number because it's the absolute value of the amplitude. And the period is always defined as 2 pi over the absolute value of b, where this here, this number in front of your x, will always be your b value. And that's going to be the same for the sine and the cosine curve. So those are two formulas that are important for you to know. Let's see how we'll use those. All right, let's talk first about some characteristics of the sine graph. All right, it's periodic, it's repeating. So that period, that up and down curve will go on and on and on forever. The cycle is the shortest repeating pattern. So I showed you one cycle. The period is the horizontal length of each cycle. So on the one I showed you, the period was 2 pi. The domain is all real numbers because on the x-axis, it can go on and on forever. That curve can go up and down in a wave, on and on and on. But the range for your standard sine curve is going to be between -1 and 1. Now, we can stretch that curve, as you're going to see in a little bit, and we can change that. But for your standard sine curve, it'll be between -1 and 1. And the amplitude is always going to be half the distance between the min and the max value. So in books, you'll see it written as this. The amplitude is 1/2 the min and the max. I just think of it as the height of one of the bumps. I think that's just the easiest way to think of it. And your x-intercepts are always going to be at 0, pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, etc., as long as you don't have any shifting, which again we'll talk about later. The cosine curve is going to be the same exact curve, except it's going to start and end at different points. So this here is your cosine curve. Now you can see it's going to start at the amplitude, and at its period 2 pi, it's also going to be at the amplitude. Halfway in between, it'll be at the negative amplitude. And then halfway between these 2 points, it'll be at 0. And halfway between these 2 points, it'll be 0. So this here, if I can draw this, whoops, let's go red. This here is going to be one cycle. So where it starts at the amplitude and ends at the amplitude, this is one cycle. So one cycle here, the period on this one would be 2 pi because it starts at 0 and goes to 2 pi. So what I've drawn here on this one here is 2 cycles, because that would be one cycle, and then this over here would be the other cycle. So this is 2 cycles drawn. Okay? All right, and here you just see the sine and cosine curve together. You can see that they're very similar curves. It's just that one kind of has a horizontal shift over the other. And we're going to see when we start writing equations that you can write any sine curve as a cosine curve with a horizontal shift, and vice versa. All right, so how are we going to graph these? Again, right now we're talking without horizontal shifts. So if I want to graph y equals 3 times the sine of x, I have y equals a times the sine of bx. That's my standard form. So I need to figure out a couple of things about this first. So I want to know what the amplitude is. Well, the amplitude is the absolute value of a, and you see here, this is my a value. Now I need to know what the period is, and if you remember, the period is defined as 2 pi over the absolute value of b. So I need to know what b is first. Well, here's b in front of my x in this equation. And in front of my x, I don't have anything. So 1 is assumed. So b is 1. If I wanted to find out my period, it's 2 pi over 1, which will be 2 pi. So that means my sine curve, one curve is going to start at 0 and end at 2 pi. So on the x-axis, I'm going to mark the positive and the negative period because I'm going to actually graph 2 cycles of this. So I'm going to start at 2 pi and at negative 2 pi. Then I'm going to break that into half again. So I'm going to go to pi and negative pi and make a mark there. And then I'm going to break that in half again. So I'm going to be at pi over 2 and negative pi over 2. So really what you're doing is you're taking your period, which is 2 pi, and you're dividing it by 4. That'll give you 1 cycle. And then you'll repeat all of that on the negative side to give you the second cycle. And just make sure your y-axis is large enough to accommodate the positive and negative amplitude. In this case, it'll be 3. So this is kind of what your graph will look like, right? I have 0, I have 2 pi, then I made negative 2 pi. I put pi halfway in between 0 and 2 pi is pi, so I put pi here and then negative pi. And halfway in between these two is pi over 2, so I put pi over 2. And then halfway in between these two is 3 pi over 2. And the easy way to find this one is to say, well, this is 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2. So now that I've kind of set up my graph, I have both positive and then negative values. So I'm going to actually graph 2 cycles of this. So since it's a sine curve, we know it's going to start at 0. So I'm going to put a dot at 0. Well, I know in a sine curve, it's going to be 0 at both the positive and negative period and halfway between those. So it's going to be also 0 at 2 pi, and it's going to be 0 at negative 2 pi. But it's also going to be 0 halfway in between these two. So it'll be also 0 at pi and negative pi. That will always be true on a sine curve, as long as we don't have any shifts, which we'll be talking about later. So since it's a sine curve, that should be sine curve, not since curve. In a sine curve, the amplitude will be the other points. So if my amplitude is positive, I'm going to start at my positive amplitude. So here, I'm going to be here at positive 3, and then in between the next 2 points, I'll be at negative 3. And now you can kind of see the way the curve is going. So now when I go on the negative side, I'm going to be at negative my amplitude, and then positive amplitude. And then I just connect the dots in kind of a nice smooth curve, trying not to make the curve too pointed. It's supposed to be an actual curve. So in general, when you're doing your sine curve, you're going to have a point at 0, and then the positive and negative period will also be 0, and halfway between those points will be zeros. The amplitude will be in between all of those points, so you're going to start positive will be to the right, and if your amplitude is negative, then negative will be to the right. So let's take a look at how we would do this one. All right, so the first thing you have to do is you have to write down what your amplitude is and what your period is. So again, this is the generic form of my equation. So I know my amplitude is 2. Remember, the amplitude is always the absolute value of the A value. So even though my A value is negative 2, when you're asked what is the amplitude, it's 2. Because what it's really asking you is what is the height of the curve? And the height would never be negative. Your B value in this case, again, is 1. So your period is 2 pi over the absolute value of B, or 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi. And that's pretty much your standard curve. So you know when your period is 2 pi, you're always going to go from negative 2 pi to 2 pi. You're going to have pi in between, and then pi over 2, negative pi over 2, pi over 3, and negative pi over 3. That's kind of your standard curve. So if you remember, it's your sine curve. So you know you're going to start at 0. You're going to put a dot at 0 at your positive period and your negative period, and halfway in between those. Well, this is a negative amplitude now, right? So I have a negative amplitude. Even though I'm writing it as positive, I know to graph it, I have to go negative. So my first point, which is going to be in between my 0 and pi, I have to be at my negative amplitude. Which means in order to finish one cycle, I'm going to have to be at my positive amplitude. So this now here would be one cycle. I just kind of continue this pattern for the rest of the curve. So now if I'm going negative, I'm going to be here at my positive amplitude and then my negative amplitude. And then I'm just going to connect my dots in as smooth of a curve as I can. Let's take a look at this one. This one's a little tougher because now we've changed the period. So once again, you're always going to start by writing down what is your A value, what is your B value, and what is your period. So in this case, my A value is 1/2. Now my B value is 2. So my period is 2 pi over the absolute value of B, which is 2 pi over 2, which is simply pi. So now when I'm writing, drawing out my x-axis, I'm going to have my period is going to go from pi to negative pi. Well, I need to know what's halfway in between those two. So halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. So to go on the negative side, I'm going to go negative pi over 2. Well, I still need to know what's halfway in between those two, because remember, what you're really doing is you're dividing pi into fourths. So I'm going to have positive pi over 4, negative pi over 4. And in between these two, right, I've got 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. So this one here will be 3 pi over 4 and negative 3 pi over 4. So now I've sketched my x-axis, and my y-axis, I'm going to be going from positive 1/2 to negative 1/2. Now that I've drawn my axis out, all I have to do is place my points. It's a sine curve, so I know it's going to start at 0. It's also going to be 0 at my positive period and negative period, and halfway in between those. My amplitude is positive, so I know between my first and second points, or to the right of 0, I'm going to start at my positive amplitude, then go to my negative amplitude, and I'm going to reverse it on the negative side. And then I'm going to draw my nice little curve here. So this would be the graph for the y equals 1/2 sine of 2x. All right, let's see how we graph the cosine curve. So if you remember, the cosine curve is really going to be graphed exactly the same, except instead of starting at 0, I'm going to start at my amplitude. So you still have to figure out what your A value is, your B value, and your period. So in this case, my amplitude is 3, my B value is 1, so my period is 2 pi. So this means I can use my standard curve. I can go from negative 2 pi to positive 2 pi. But now when I'm starting, I have to start at my amplitude. So at 0, I'll be at my positive amplitude. At the end of my period, at 2 pi, I'll also be at my positive amplitude. And on the other side, at negative pi, I will be also at my amplitude. So when you have a cosine curve, you're going to start and end always at your amplitude. Well, halfway in between my first point and my second point, between 0 and 2 pi, I'm going to be at my negative amplitude. And halfway in between 0 and negative 2 pi, I will also be at my negative amplitude. And then halfway between my first and second point, I'm going to be at 0. And halfway between my pi and 2 pi here now, I'm going to be at 0 again. So anything that's not at an amplitude or negative amplitude will be at 0. And then I'm just going to connect my curve here. Let's try one where the period is not equal to 1. It makes it a little bit tougher. So my amplitude is 2. My B value is 4. So my period is 2 pi over the absolute value of 4, which is 4. So my period is pi over 2. So when I'm drawing this out, again, I'm going to take my pi over 2 and I'm going to divide it in fourths. So I'm going to be making my graph in eighths. But another way to do it is to say I'm going to start at pi over 2, I'm going to end at negative pi over 2. Halfway in between, I'll be at pi over 4 and negative pi over 4. And halfway in between those points, I'll be at pi over 8 and negative pi over 8. Or I've got 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8. So this next one will be 3 pi over 8 and negative 3 pi over 8. My amplitude is 2, so I'm going to be going from positive 2 to negative 2. All right, now I have to remember that this is a cosine curve that I'm going to be graphing. So since it's a cosine curve, at 0, I'm going to be at my positive amplitude because this 2 is positive. I'm going to end at my positive amplitude on either sides of my period. And halfway in between my period, I'll be at my negative amplitudes. and every other point will be at 0. And now I can just draw my curve. So this takes a little practice. Let me know if you have questions.